The Map of the Mystery. Why Atlantis Matters. The word Atlantis names two things at once: a place no one can point to on a map with confidence, and a question that refuses to leave the stage for 2.5 millennia. What we truly know is exactly what we are willing to accept as a source. In the 4th century BCE, Plato set into the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, a tale of a great island kingdom beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in today's terms, beyond Gibraltar. Out where, in Greek imagination, the Atlantic Ocean began as the outer sea, there lived a powerful society, richly provisioned and sure of itself, bold enough to challenge the world around it. That society, Plato says, perished in a single day and night in a natural catastrophe. The earth split. The island sank beneath the water. The story is brief, yet vivid enough to tempt readers to test it against geography and archaeology, enough to work as an allegory of arrogance and reckoning. In this opening chapter, we lay out the kit parts on the table. What exactly Plato wrote, in what context, why it grips both imagination and reason, and how we'll test the edges of the possible without inventing what isn't there. In Plato, the episode is embedded not in geography, but in a conversation about the proper ordering of life. In Timaeus, we hear a chain of transmission. Solon, traveling in Egypt, allegedly heard from the priests of Sais a story about an ancient war between Athenians and a great maritime power. Generations later, the tale was retold in his family, and, at last, in Plato's day, Critias recounts it. This chain itself signals that we are not reading an eyewitness chronicle, but a philosophical text that leans on the authority of antiquity and on another literary tradition, mythic and admonitory. In Critias, the details become lush: concentric rings of sea and land, the city of Poseidon at the center, rare metals, including the puzzling orichalcum harbors, a wealth of water and fertility, deliberate urban design. Right alongside runs the moral register. The Atlanteans, beginning noble and measured, forget moderation at the height of their wealth and power, and so, the god, seeing their condition, judged to punish them. The tale does not hide its pedagogical purpose. If this were merely the story of a vanished island, we would long ago have resigned ourselves to its loss. But Plato offers a portrait of temptation. When strength and knowledge detach from measure, they become vulnerable not only to gods, but to their own errors. Why has the story worked for so long? Because 3 planes align too perfectly. First is the geographic. The point of departure is clear, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The urban details are intelligible: canals, navigable channels, terraces. The description of climate and natural abundance invites trust. Second is the psychological. We are drawn to tales in which a civilization with every sign of success meets a limit it failed to recognize in time. That is a universal human theme. Third is the philosophical. Plato deliberately sets Atlantis against an ideal image of Athens, where the polis rests on education, law, and moderation. This is not a fairy tale split between good guys and bad. It is a contrast of ways of life. For that reason, the myth repeatedly translates itself into the language of each era's concerns. During the Age of Discovery, as a summons to explore. In an age of catastrophism, as a parable about systemic collapse. In the age of science fiction, as the archetype of a lost world that might be found, revived, explained. Another hook is the balance of the concrete and the undefined. On the one hand, we see engineering specifics: 3 water rings, 3 land rings, bridges and passages, a surrounding ditch, measurements in stadia, canals leading to the sea, quaysides and arsenals. On the other hand, we have no map, no coordinates, no date on our calendar. 9,000 years before Solon may be a flipped number, a move in mythic chronology, or simply a flourish that signals ancient antiquity rather than a strict date. Plato doses clarity and mist with craftsmanship, just enough clarity to picture the layout and wealth, enough mist to keep the question inexhaustible. That is how you build a narrative that doesn't end with a yes, no. But if the myth is strong, that doesn't mean we can't work with it soberly. On the contrary, it imposes discipline. Real Atlantises circulate through popular science and journalism, from Tartessos at the mouth of the Guadalquivir to Crete and Santorini, from the Azores to the Bahamas. Yet the method is the same in every honest reading. Compare the text with geology and archaeology. Distinguish late fantasies from ancient testimony. Remember the limits of what any comparison can establish. Not every set of concentric forms on a satellite image deserves to be called Atlantis. Not every eruption and tsunami automatically explains the single day and night. Conversely, the fact that Plato paints with broad strokes, a city as image rather than a technical report, doesn't make every attempt at linkage meaningless. In this lecture, we will tread carefully, naming sources where they exist, acknowledging ignorance where it outweighs the data, keeping the allegorical meaning alongside testable hypotheses, not instead of them. There is a risk on the other side as well, to dance around the word Atlantis and forget that Plato is talking about how a city survives prosperity. His Atlanteans are not barbarians. To the contrary, they begin disciplined, cooperative, skilled in building and in reckoning with the land. The failure starts not from savagery, but from surplus. Wealth destroys itself by its own brilliant properties once those properties are used to measure everything else. That motif matters precisely because it does not age. Technologies change. Limits to growth are debated under new terms, but temptation is recognizable by the same symptoms, meaning replaced by form, rule observed as ritual for ritual's sake, legality bent to the convenience of the powerful. Plato's idea of measure is not a sermon on virtue. It is a safety protocol for large systems. To avoid drowning in conflicting expectations, we need a working plan. First, the primary source, how Timaeus and Critias are composed, why Plato brings in Egyptian priests and Solon, what tone and vocabulary he uses where Atlantis is concerned. Next, geography and method, what beyond the Pillars of Hercules meant on ancient maps, which landscape and climate cues appeal to reality, where scale and numbers bother us. Then, the earthly Atlantises, the Cretan Thera line, Tartessos, Atlantic shelves, the little ones around the Canaries. Separately, a candid talk about hypotheses that are pretty, but methodologically weak, when people lay on the table not Plato's text, but later legends, and why it is so tempting to search for a continent where an island was needed. Only after that, the cultural biography of the myth, from Renaissance studies to the entertainment industry, from theosophy to science fiction. And in the end, the lesson: how to read Atlantis so that we keep both the appetite for exploration and the philosophical warning. One more hidden parameter to name at the outset: expectation. The myth of a lost civilization is magnetic because it promises the impossible to retrieve what we never had. That is potent fuel for cinema and tourism, but it also pushes thought down the wrong paths, swapping argument for a striking analogy, gathering matches without asking about probability, seizing on a pretty number, and forgetting it could have been rhetorical. We will try, without throwing away the beauty of the image, to keep our feet on the ground. Where archaeology and geology let us speak, we will speak. Where they do not, we will leave the question on the table. The rule is simple. A myth is good to the degree that it helps us think better about the real world. not worse. Now to the basic kit parts, without which the discussion cannot proceed. Plato's Atlantis is an archipelago around a large island rich in water, rivers, hot springs, navigable canals. The capital city has concentric rings, bridged and key-lined, with harbors and arsenals for ships. The land is fertile, capable of yielding 2 crops a year. There are forests, herds, ample building stone, and metals. The political order is a kingship with 10 houses, descended from Poseidon's 10 sons, bound by oath, yet prone, over time, to rivalry. And finally, the main arc is moral, a beginning in noble moderation, then a slow loss of measure under the pressure of external wealth, and an internal event, the ebbing of the divine portion. We will set these elements against what we know of real societies of the Bronze Age in the Aegean and Atlantic worlds, of island economies, of how geological disasters, eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, are reworked into cultural memory. Not to identify Atlantis, but to grasp why this myth struck educated ancient readers as plausible. A word, too, about that one day and night. The formula acts like a cymbal crash in an orchestra, evoking a catastrophe, both instant and total. In real history, though, the abrupt is rarely solitary. Most collapses come as overlapping waves, a natural blow, then a trade crisis, then political redivision, then demographic decline. Plato heightens the color so his audience hears the admonition. Stepping back from the allegory, we will examine composite scenarios, how natural traumas enter folklore, how in time they can furnish antiquity with a composite image of a drowned maritime power, and why that image is so convenient as both art and philosophy. A final note on the borders of imagination. To study ancient texts is to live with gaps. Sometimes an archaeological find sharpens the text. Sometimes it unsettles straightforward readings. We will not correct Plato to fit a pet theory, nor force-fit any candidate into the Atlantis stencil. We will ask the questions that any attempt at pinning to place must face. Does the relief match? Are there traces of hydraulic works on the required scale? Do the dates line up? Are there independent sources beyond late retellings of Plato's schematic? What do geomorphology and paleoclimate say? If the answers are fuzzy, we will say so. That, too, is respect for the myth's strength, refusing to turn it into a crossword solved in haste. Finally, the why. Atlantis offers a handy template for talking about resilience, how wealth reshapes institutions, where the line runs between complexity and fragility. Why cities build canals and quays yet fall, not because they were built badly, but because the ligaments around them, trust, law, the habit of measured work, ran thin. In that sense, Atlantis is not about where the treasure lies, but about what not to yield to. In today's arguments over climate risk, the cost of luxury, and the way empires tire of themselves, Plato's story sounds like a careful warning. Even the strong need a language of measure, or strength becomes its own catastrophe. So our route is clear. We begin with Plato's text free of grafted-in details he never wrote, and attentive to those he did. Then we move to a narrow set of geographic candidates, where the data density is highest and the temptation to see a sensation is lowest. After that, we will examine the entrenched Minoan scenario and its limits, outline other versions, and then the cultural biography of the myth from Renaissance, reading rooms to streaming video. We close where Plato began, with measure quiet, but long-lived. Seen through this optic, Atlantis ceases to be merely a legend that isn't there. It becomes a mirror in which it is convenient to try on questions for ourselves, where we stand on measure, where we are shiny without substance, Which of our canals deliver value, and which are just symbols and self-soothing? With such a mirror, it is easier to go on, neither to stoke empty hopes nor to quench curiosity, but to keep apart what can be checked from what should be discussed as an image. In that modest discipline lies the chance to wring the most benefit from an old myth. Tekun, Plato's Timaeus and Critias, How the Myth is Written. If you want to know where Atlantis comes from, you have to return not to maps or satellite images, but to two philosophical dialogues by Plato, Timaeus, and Critias. This is the only ancient corpus where the myth is set out in detail. Neither Herodotus nor Thucydides nor any earlier author reports anything like it. Later, writers revisit the story only with Plato in view. That means we are not dealing with a mysterious chronicle recovered from missing scrolls, but with a consciously designed component of Plato's larger project, a meditation on how the world is ordered and what way of life fits that order. The composition runs like this. In Timaeus, Socrates recalls yesterday's exchange about the ideal state. His companions, Critias and Timaeus, propose to show that polis in action by setting it against a great maritime power of ancient times that undertook to test it. The source of the ancient history is framed to secure the plausibility of antiquity. Solon, the eminent Athenian, is said to have heard the tale from the priests of Sais in Egypt, to have brought it home, told it. He sketches labor and logistics, dams and crossings, paved passages, shipyards with all the gear, for cavalry and chariots. These details are a temptation to any reader. The text seems to ask for a ruler and a chart. Political organization is equally considered. Poseidon left 10 sons. From them came 10 houses and 10 kings, each ruling his district, yet bound to meet and judge common affairs. The first of them bears 2 names, Greek Eumelos and the local Gadaros. Plato immediately flags the bilingual world beyond Gibraltar. Law is inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum in the temple. Oaths are sworn by it, and judgments rendered. The kings assemble every 5th and 6th year alternately, hunt a bull, sacrifice it to Poseidon, and renew their oath of fidelity to the common law. This ritual is not ornamental. It carries political meaning. Family pride and regional might bow to an archetypically external standard. The divine and only, thus does the league hold. Plato formulates the moral nerve of the myth with crispness. The Atlanteans begin as a people of moderation and justice with a strong divine share in them. Wealth and power slowly alter them. Metals, luxury, victories, the strength of fleet. These push measure aside until the mortal admixture takes over. This is not a tale of the virtuous poor and the wicked rich. Plato does not idealize poverty. He writes about excess unmanaged by discipline. Hence the opposition with ancient Athens is not good versus evil, but a laboratory of regimes, where education, paideia, law, and the habit of self-restraint lead. A city can meet a challenge. Where the appearance of the divine thins out, dikes and walls fail as well. We are reading not an ancient news bulletin, but a polished parable about hubris, self-expansion beyond measure. Numbers in Critias and Timaeus are part of the rhetoric. We hear of 9,000 years from Solon back to the war, of widths and distances in stadia, of volumes of fill, wall heights. These figures often become a battlefield. Should years be read as months, perhaps the Egyptian priests spoke in a different calendric idiom. Were tens and hundreds confused? Can we treat units literally? The technique is plain. Precise numbers create a feel of materiality. Plato feigns an engineer's report on a place none of his listeners has seen, and by doing so, he achieves a sense of presence. Genre matters. We are reading philosophical prose in which a semblance of precision serves the thought. The Athenian counterpoint is another instrument. Plato stages two scenes: ancient Athens, the older polis of the Virgin Athena, and Atlantis, the domain of Poseidon. Athens is poor in resources but rich in order. Atlantis is rich in everything but grows poor in measure. In the war, a small city repels a great adversary. To a 4th century Greek ear, this worked as therapy after the traumas of Periclean grandeur and the Peloponnesian War. Greatness lies not in imperial sheen, but in discipline. To us, it reads as a reminder of the price of resilience. Not every success matures into longevity. Plato's manner of writing helps the myth endure. He avoids a fairy tale tone. Instead, he shelves the project, where the harbor sits, where the arsenal, how the ditch is cut, what the bridge rests on, which stone went where. He adds cultural markers: the temple of Poseidon with its gilded roof, the god's statue on a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, the round sacred precinct entered only by right. He notes that the island had mountains and plains and abundant water, no desert world. He even names a detail meant to emphasize the far abroad to a Greek listener. And elephants were many there. In this prose of things sits the secret of the image's tenacity. It assembles from details you can almost touch. Unfinishedness is significant. Critias ends where Zeus gathers the gods to deliberate punishment. The promised speech of Zeus never comes. Some readers see this as a loss of manuscript. Many critics view it as a deliberate pause. The thought for which the myth was introduced has already been delivered. A city without measure loses its divine share and moves toward ruin. Describing the catastrophe adds nothing. The unwritten Hermocrates, likely intended to address practical politics, underlines the point. Plato did not aim to close the plot, but to tune his reader's optics. The Egyptian motif deserves a word. Why does Plato export the tale to Sais? Because for Greeks, Egypt was a land of archives, antiquity, and long memory. Through that mask, one can more easily speak of time that won't fit Greek chronology. 9,000 years is far too much for Greek history, but tolerable for Egyptian time. It also lends the myth respectful standing. Not a fable pulled from a writer's cabinet, but a translation from an old tongue. Plato also stresses a cultural gap. The priests of Sais rebuke Solon for the childhood of Greek cities, destroyed repeatedly by fire and flood. They have forgotten their own antiquity. Here lies a reflection on the fragility of cultural memory, a point archaeology would later reinforce. Writing is not eternal. Libraries burn. Registers vanish. Legends serve as little bridges thrown across dark ages. The tale is framed by ritual contours. The Atlantean kings do not merely meet. They go to the temple, take a bull, sacrifice it, swear by the orichalcum pillar where the law is engraved. Ritual is a protocol of discipline. Power acknowledges a norm it cannot rewrite on the fly. Plato describes with careful emphasis how good forms later empty out, becoming bare form. Oaths still sound, but inner consent to measure is gone. The ritual machine runs without oil, and that no longer saves. The contrast is timeless. When form no longer holds substance, a system abandons self-reflection and assists its own collapse. How to read all this today strictly, without add-ons? A few orienting rules help. First, the source is one, late and philosophical in aim. We should compare it not with a novel, but with a political tract that uses a scenic lens. Second, engineered descriptions do not make the text a technical report. Numbers, measures, and materials belong to the rhetoric of plausibility. Third, the absence of pre-Plato parallels does not mean the myth was invented ex nihilo. Plato could stitch into his parable living recollections of his world of island economies, hydraulic works, sea power, and the way disasters alter cities. Fourth, any attempt at placing must begin with textual criticism. What exactly is said in which words? Move to geography and geology. What can and cannot match in landscape and dates? And only then to archaeology. Are there complexes that correspond? It is also worth recalling the Athenian mirror built into the dialogue. Plato casts his ideal polis as defender, a small, disciplined community, lacking abundant resources but rich in civic training, withstands a large, wealthy opponent. This is not nationalist propaganda, but a method show that greatness is measured not by tonnage of metal or number of ships, but by the capacity to preserve measure and agreement. In that sense, Atlantis is a primer for those who hold power. Where is the boundary passed, which success starts to destroy the hands that hold it? Finally, the language. Hubris, paideia, metron. These are not antique ornaments. With them, Plato assembles a frame in which Atlantis's destruction is not about evil fate, but about our habit of losing measure. He does not urge us to fear the gods. He reminds us that a city, like a body, dies not because it has vessels and bones, but because they cease to work in concert. One day and night is a striking shot. Behind it, as Plato intends us to read, lies a long story. The accumulation of carelessness, the substitution of hollow form for clear speech, the slipping of the common into the private. Within this optic, the question a modern reader finds most interesting, where to dig, becomes the second step, not the first. The first task is to read the primary source well. See the architecture of the argument. Notice the repetitions. Plato's repetitions are purposeful. Weigh where he lays on thick paint, metals, glitter, rarity, elephants, and where he trusts plain words, canal, bridge, wall, measure. Only then can we spread out the geographic candidates and speak candidly. Here, text and terrain rhyme. There they do not. Here the numbers sag. There the landscape answers. Along the way, it pays to be sober about sweet coincidences. Any round lagoon on a shelf need not be a ring of Atlantis. Any match of stone color is no license to declare found. Conversely, we should not dismiss natural versions with a sneer. Memory of great eruptions and sea blows truly imprinted itself around the Mediterranean, and Plato may without design have woven in motifs circulating among the elite. Crete, Thera, Santorini, sea trade, the surprising vulnerability of the rich. Mature reading means not confusing image with thing, yet not tearing them apart by force. Timaeus and Critias thus give us a stage on which a play about wealth, measure, and memory is set. Atlantis is written as a city one can walk in the mind keys, bridges, shrines, storehouses, pastures, and all the gear. But that city serves not to be believed as a geographic fact, rather to be understood as a moral blueprint. In that sense, it is real. It acts on our thinking. Next, we will return to the map, to the strait Greeks called the Pillars of Hercules, to the Atlantic Islands, to great river mouths and ancient ports. The map is the second story. The first is Plato, as he is. Third, where to search, the geography and toponymy of the myth. To ask honestly, where could this have been? You first have to clarify what a 4th century BCE Greek meant by the phrases beyond the Pillars of Hercules, island kingdom, the great continent, and the outer sea. Almost everything depends on these 4 answers. Translate them too quickly onto a modern map, and Atlantis smears across the globe. There will always be plenty of spots where you can paste concentric circles. So we begin with ancient language and mapping, set out a method for comparing text with land, and water, and only then lay on the table a few geographic knots, where hypotheses are at least testable against some of the features in the story. For Greeks, the Pillars of Hercules were not a mythic label floating in blank space, but a tangible strait, what we call Gibraltar. Names on each shore varied, but the meaning was the same. Here, the Mediterranean breaks and opens onto the outer sea, the ocean. Sailors knew the passage as a threshold narrow, with strong currents, winds, mists, and a felt step in depths, where a familiar marine room suddenly ends in a wall of water and air. Beyond the pillars began the ocean, imagined not merely as a lot of water, but as a distinct element, a ring encircling the land. When Plato says, "beyond the pillars," he is not hinting at a back door on the far side of the inland sea. He is pointing to the expanse where Greek ships rarely ventured and always warily. Next comes Plato's island kingdom. In the text, it is neither a dot nor a small scrap of land like Corfu or Delos, but a large island with canals, plains, mountains, native building stone, rich soil, and hot springs. It was girt with islands, through which one could sail onward to a great continent, adjoining the ocean on the far side. Ancient readers took this in different ways. Some saw the great continent as Africa or Iberia, taking on the far side to mean any land that faces the ocean. Others heard a more abstract thought about the other side of the world, where a vast land might lie beyond the ocean. For careful reading, we need only remember that for Greeks, the Atlantic as a water and land outside was not fantasy, but a geographic surmise born of piloting practice and rumor. A third key is time and measure. The formula 9,000 years before Solon stands in the text as a rhetorical prop for antiquity. If you drop our calendar straight onto it, Atlantis becomes older than any urban complex of the Bronze Age in the eastern Mediterranean, and the Minoan line falls out of reach at once. On the other hand, talk of Egyptian months instead of years, or of misplaced zeros, is likewise scaffolding in the opposite direction. In the geographic section, it is most reasonable to keep chronology in mind as a backdrop and first test the fit of landscape cues and hydrologic logic. If the geography jars markedly with Plato's description, rescuing the case by converting years into months is pointless. Now to the method for matching text and place. Plato gave a checklist that can be probed. 1. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules. 2. A large island with a mountain zone and a broad plain. 3. Abundant fresh water, including hot springs. 4. The possibility of cutting a navigable channel from the sea into inner harbors. 5. Locally quarried building stone in 3 colors. 6. A capital laid out in circular sea rings. 7. A climate allowing 2 harvests a year. 8. Forests, herds, and the presence of large animals. 9. Wealth in metals, including orichalcum, whatever that meant from rare alloys to a rhetorical rarity. Landscape testing isn't a simple, recognized, not recognized, but a set of plain questions. Could a proposed spot truly be an island in the required sense? Did it, within historical memory, have a contour that would admit ringed basins as harbors? Are there traces of large-scale hydraulic works? Is there enough water for the intensity of circulation described? What stones does local architecture use? Do soils and seasons match a 2-harvest regime? Water deserves special attention. Plato's Atlantis is a world of canals, not a city by the sea, but a city led into the sea, an outer moat, an entrance channel, inner straits, harbors, arsenals. To avoid being seduced by satellite images of pretty lagoons, remember 2 simple facts. First, concentric forms arise easily in nature-extinct volcanic calderas, karstic sinkholes, ghosted meander loops in river deltas, sea lagoons behind barrier bars. Second, a system fit for everyday navigation needs not only form, but also reliable depth and protection from swell and silt. Where wind-driven seas and tides hammer at the mouth, basin rings choke fast. A city with arsenals lives in bursts, not centuries. A basic mariner's criterion, where ships can lie, what natural breakwater there is, how sand and silt behave, will sometimes sweep an attractive candidate off the table faster than archaeology can. With that in mind, it's useful to mark several knots around the Atlantic and its shores, where hypotheses tend to cluster, not because they are automatically strong, but because there the text's cues and the landscape's givens meet often enough to tempt a trial. The first knot is the southwest of Iberia, the Guadalquivir estuary, and the old wetlands around today's Doñana. Classical authors place the wealthy land of Tartessos, here rich in copper and silver, salt and purple, early ties to Phoenicia, legendary kings and songs that did not reach us. The picture is seductive. Beyond the Pillars, a great river mouth, a delta that wandered over millennia, shaping islands and spits, lagoons and channels. From orbit you see circles and crescents. Shoal barriers promise inner water. Trade thrummed here. Local power could rise on metal and salt. Wells yield fresh water close to the shore. Nature seems to beg for concentric harbors and a found at last. Sorting the shelves quickly cools the mood. First, islandness. Deltas are capricious. Today a peninsula, tomorrow a chain of low islets, the day after a continuous shoal. Only the main channel keeps a face. Plato's large island with mountains and a broad plain is not delta language. Second, ring harbors. In a low delta, tides and surf incessantly remodel the throat of any lagoon. Without constant dredging and retaining structures, a navigable ring silts up in a handful of stormy seasons. Third, scale. Plato's capital runs a few kilometers from outer rings to the central hill. On photogenic delta, circles, distances are either too small, toy lagoons, or too large, broad lakes and limans, and in neither case is there a workable neck one could keep in trim for centuries. Fourth, stone and metal. Iberia has ores aplenty. Yes, limestones and red sandstones give you the three-color palette. But Bronze Age port architecture at a scale that would fit Plato's engineered city is elusive here. Stone moles and covered arsenals are usually late. Earlier installations were timber and sand, flimsier and harder to see. Finally, water. 2 harvests are realistic in the Atlantic climate of southwestern Spain, but then we must expect canals and ditches, revetments, sluice logic, the hydraulic language Plato describes from inside. You need it in the ground, not just on paper. In fairness, the Tartessos lead is an excellent school for reading with the shore. It teaches you to distinguish island from bar, harbor from pretty circle, abundance of water from a marsh that will shift its channel next year. It proves that beyond the pillars truly means beyond, but does not therefore mean there and only there. It reminds us that a wealthy ancient land need not be Plato's Atlantis simply because it has a river, metal, and early traders. Tartessos to Mialgot Atlantis is poor quality, but good training. The second knot is the arcs of islands in the northeast Atlantic, the Canaries, Madeira, the Azores. They literally lie beyond the pillars. They flaunt volcanic calderas, whose rings invite the imagination to let the sea in. Their stone palette is lava-rich and three-toned. With water and terraces, the climate still gives 2 crops. They also make obvious seaways, a chain of stepping stones. Against them, stands the simple fact that antiquity did not sail here as a matter of routine, and the archaeological silhouettes are too young, or else too modest, to sustain Plato's level of engineering. Calderas play Atlantis to the eye, but mariners quickly remind you of Atlantic swell on these coasts. Building arsenals into such a surf is no small feat. A weighty counterpoint is depth. Plato's plain with canals is a low coastal country, not a set of steep, friable volcanic shelves. The third knot is the Atlantic shelf itself. On a bathymetric chart, you see banks and plateaus that guidebooks love to call sunken islands. Geology is stricter. The ocean floor grew from plate motion, volcanism, and sedimentation. Large islands that could have sunk in a day and night within human time are rare to the point of fantasy. What we see are overwhelmingly long processes in which shorelines retreat and advance over millennia. Tying Atlantis to a submerged continental plateau runs straight into timescale mismatch. That does not ruin the exercise. Broad shelves are worth watching because lagoons and barrier islands there do make rings and canals. But even there, harbor engineering soon demands constant channel work and embankment. The fourth knot is the Mediterranean, not the place, and yet too perfectly matched in many details. To many readers, it feels natural to fit Atlantis to the Aegean. The engineered flavor of Plato's prose calls to where palace complexes, painted magazines, sea routes, and eruptions stood in fact. We will weigh that intuition in the next chapter, on Crete and Thera, Santorini. For our geographic purpose, however, one problem dominates. Plato insists on placing the story beyond the strait. If we drag it back inside, we must explain why he is so adamant about sending the reader into the ocean. Otherwise, any inner sea candidate becomes not a reading of Plato, but a mirror of our desires. Returning to method, it helps to keep a handful of control lists for geography, water, materials, and scale. Geography. Is there a true island, a coherent mass with its own mountain plain core, rather than a spit or a delta living on borrowed time? Where does so much fresh water come from? Do springs issue where lava meets slope, or from fissured limestone? Is there now, or in paleo reconstructions, a plain framed by heights where a grand canal would make sense? Water. Could a navigable link, sea inner rings, survive local winds and tides? Where would the silt go? How would you keep the throat clear, and by what labor? Materials. Do the three stone colors occur in local masonry, not just in the quarry? Or are they rhetorical paint? What about metals? What could orichalcum mean here? Slag, alloy, a rare resource with a trade premium? Scale. Does the picture live at distances measured in stadia so that you can visualize a capital with a few kilometer walk from outer belt to inner hill? If a candidate needs rings tens of kilometers wide, with an inner city no wall could command, Plato's engineering logic begins to creak. Add to this a human factor of the map, sailors, wind, and sand. Atlantic swell and seasonal storms do things to a shoreline that look trivial on paper. Any ocean harbor needs a nose and back, a natural headland and inner protection, or else you will bail it out daily. Inner ring basins work where reefs or bars crack the wave, and the entrance can be shuttered. The flip side is in fill. In any narrow throat saturation with sand and mud is the work of months. Plato's city requires a permanent core of diggers and shipwrights, or the rings will choke. Chasing perfect circles on imagery is useless. Look instead for places with a natural break against the sea, where artificial channels would be rational. Compare now two placement regimes, conscientious and sensation hunting. The conscientious starts with the text, sorts its features into physical, Geography, water. Economic, yields, timber. Engineering, harbors, canals. Cultural, shrines, rites. Then matches them to a concrete zone and admits plainly, this fits, that doesn't. It doesn't correct the text to suit the place, nor massage the place to meet the text. The sensational flips the order. It finds a striking image, a round lagoon, a neat platform, overlays Critias on it, declares victory, then packs the bundle into possible explanations, flattering imagination, and shooing away dull questions. Where do you get that much fresh water? How do you live with the surf? Why don't the dates align? There is only one defense. Keep a geologist's loop and a seaman's ruler on the desk. A brief word on climate and 2 harvests. This is a helpful filter because it isn't easily faked. The Mediterranean, given water and terraces, yields 2 crops. So do trade-wind islands, if water and soil are at hand. The climate filter rarely eliminates candidates. Rather, it forces us to weigh irrigation's role. If everything depends on canals, we are dealing with an engineered water budget. Then the city must have a water-back mountains, vapor condensers, springs which Plato names outright. Where these are missing, 2 harvests sinks into poetic hope. What you mustn't do is push myth in place of geology. Solutions that postulate a mid-ocean continent that plunged entire in a night are common in pictures and poor in physics. Plate tectonics and sea-level chronometers explain why such scenes don't pass without fantasy. That doesn't kill the plot. It returns us to real mechanisms of a single day and night. A strong quake, a wave, failure of dikes and walls, flooding of low districts, fire, food crisis, and out the other side, a society that looks like a drowned city because its infrastructure ceased to be infrastructure, and its memory ceased to be memory. This scenario is less sensational, but it works better in our world. Shelves and deltas have always had risks, and those are what leave marks in people's stories. A note on the great continent, on the far side, reachable from Atlantis by hopping island to island. On today's map, it's easy to draw steps toward the Americas Canaries, Azores, the Grand Banks. For an ancient mind, this was more a geographical possibility than a route. We should separate Plato's world picture, there may be a continent in the ocean, from our retrospective knowledge, there is indeed America. Mixing the two produces the trivial proof after the fact. The myth predicted the new world. Plato's move needs no such help. He looked past the edge of a familiar sea and set there a form suited to argument. That is enough. We need not pile modern credit on him. A word on toponymy. In Critias, Plato drops a couple of local names, Gadeiros instead of Eumelos, a hint of double names around Gibraltar. This is not a secret chart. It's a device that ennobles the description. The world beyond the strait has its own tongue and names. The simple rule follows. Be careful when early modern seekers of Atlantis force foreign toponyms to fit desired Greek ones. Proof begins not with Gadeiros sounds like Gadir, Cadiz, but with hard matches, shore, water, stone, harbor feasibility. You can always tutor a name. You cannot tutor a bar and a channel. On the 3 colors of stone, white, black, red avoid exoticism. White limestones, reddish sandstones or ferric rocks, dark basalts or andesites are a common trio anywhere limestone massifs meet volcanic arcs. The point returns. Plato's details are plausible by recognizable materiality, not uniqueness. Their strength lies in the assembly, not the parts. As for orichalcum, keep a cool head. The holy pillar, sheathed in this rare metal, is a rhetorical device, lending the law's place a glow of preciousness. Some hear copper-based alloys, some a legendary metal second to gold. Geographically, it hardly guides us. Bright plating can be had anywhere trade and craft flourish. Using orichalcum as a geological pointer is asking the text to do someone else's work. Finally, scale. Plato's Atlantis has a graspable form, from outer ring to middle to inner. At the heart, a hill and shrine. Not a megacity spanning hundreds of kilometers, and not a toy town either. Roughly, it's space you could walk across in a day, making the harbor mechanics plausible and the workshops connectable to the docks. If a real-world candidate forces the rings to stretch for dozens of kilometers, and the inner city can neither be enclosed nor commanded, Plato's functional logic starts to grind. Conscientious approaches test exactly this. Does scale keep step with function? The picture that emerges when myth meets map is sober. Shelves and deltas do offer forms that invite us to imagine Atlantis. Some coasts have the water and rock that sit well with Plato's materiality. In some zones, climate and yield sing in key. Yet grounds for confident placement arise only where these strands twine together. A realistic chance of ringed basins and channels, given swell and silt. Traces of major Bronze Age engineering, not later harbor rebuilds. Strong freshwater supply off the heights. A relief where plain and mountain backs make a natural bowl, and a historical frame in which a sea power could arise. Such places exist. We will return to them, but only after we tackle the reason so many readers link the earthly image of Atlantis to the Aegean. The Minoan world. 3 plain conclusions for the road. First, beyond the pillars really means beyond. If you drag the myth back inside the Mediterranean, you need more than taste. You need textual warrant. Second, an island kingdom is not a low delta or a spit, but a mass with its own water regime, mountain back, and buildable harbor geometry. A pretty satellite circle does not guarantee that mass. Third, the best comparisons work not by flashes of looks like doesn't, but by assemblies, geology, plus hydrology, plus sea mechanics, plus archaeology, where even 2 of the 4 sag, an honest version fades into a beautiful legend. With this optic, it makes sense to move to the most common earthly explanation. The notion that Plato reworked cultural memory of Aegean disasters, the eruption of Thera, Santorini, storms and surges that shook the Minoan sea net, the unseating of treaties and markets that, from the shore, feel like one day and night. Much there truly sounds similar, and much refuses to line up. We will weigh the strengths and limits of that hypothesis, keeping our discipline. Language, map, water, engineering, time. 4. Minoans and Santorini. An earthly Atlantis? When people say Atlantis must have had a real prototype, they most often mean the Bronze Age Aegean, above all the Minoan civilization of Crete, and the catastrophic eruption of the volcano Thera, Santorini. The temptation is easy to grasp. A maritime power with developed infrastructure, palace networks, frescoes of ships, complex magazines, and roads, and then fire, ash, waves, empty quays, and a political landscape redrawn. The story itself seems to beg for the metaphor of one day and night. As always, though, the devil is in the details. To weigh the Minoan Atlantis hypothesis fairly, it helps to break it into 4 planes: Plato's language, geography and water, economy and engineering, disaster dynamics, and then ask what lines up and what does not. Start with the extraordinary materiality of the age. Knossos, Phaistos, Malaya, Zakros. These are not merely palaces, but nodes in a network of roads, workshops, granaries, and shrines. On the walls, processions, Minoan blues and ochres, the flash of bull's horns and double axes. In storerooms, hundreds of pithoi. in archives, clay tablets, some still undeciphered in Linear A, others already Greek, Linear B, in the later phase, when Mycenaeans begin administering Cretan economy. At Akrotiri on Santorini, a whole town survives, 2-story houses, drain pipes, wall paintings with ships, fishermen, flowers, monkeys. You can walk those streets almost as if in a present-day quarter. Steps, thresholds, long windows, corners, where the wind holds the smell of sea. This is the engineering prose of the era that so resembles Plato's Atlantis. Canals, harbors, bridges, materials, routine. The sea was the Minoan element. From Crete, routes ran dense to the Cyclades, the Peloponnese, the Anatolian coast, and on to the Levant and Egypt. Frescoes and finds show a nuanced feel for maritime life. Shell purple, sails, oars, mooring horns for hawser lines, miniature ship models that tell us far more than the dry phrase, trade and contacts. In this sense, Plato's line about a mighty maritime power truly resonates on Crete. Climate belongs here too. With terraces and water, the land can yield 2 crops, a matter-of-fact reality, which makes the naturalism of Plato's abundance feel unforced. Now to water and fire. The Thera eruption is among the most powerful natural shocks of the Mediterranean Bronze Age. First a column of ash and gas, then caldera collapse and tsunamis. The blow was complex and came in rounds. Ash fell unevenly across the Aegean. Tephra layers show up throughout the eastern Mediterranean in cores, sediments, seabeds. On Crete's north coast, some sections register marine impact, tsunami traces meet shores. Coastal sites show broken horizons. On Santorini itself, towns like Akrotiri are buried quickly. Life ends with the word, immediately. But the picture on Crete is more complicated. The blow was severe without being a single, all-erasing stroke. The volcano did not wipe out the entire network. The eruption shook it, damaged harbors, scrambled sailing. Why, then, does the hypothesis persist so stubbornly? Because it follows a genuinely persuasive logic of compression. The Minoan package sea power, palace administration, refined public ritual, art in which festivals and processions are scheduled parts of life, looks like Plato's catalog of what a great power prides itself on. And Plato's catastrophe is moral, but wrapped in imagery of a natural strike. Likewise, in the Aegean, we see a natural strike, and behind it, social vulnerability. Shaken trade, a name and sway built on certain exchange regimes that falter when bridges and quays literally turn precarious. Empty shipyards and crewless hulls make a potent scene and cling perfectly to Plato's rhetoric about losing measure. Where do mismatches begin? First at the doorway marked beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Plato insists on placing Atlantis beyond Gibraltar in the outer ocean. The Minoans live inside the Mediterranean, very much on this side of the threshold. One can, almost ritually, declare that Plato chose the wrong door, or that Egypt meant by pillars something else. But that is no longer reading the text. It is forcing a translation. Second is the form of the capital. Concentric sea rings, an outer ditch, inner channels. This is a handsome diagram, but Minoan centers show another kind of urban body. Spreading platforms, terraces, open courts, stepped ways, rectilinear plans. Even the labyrinth of Knossos is not circular, but a chessboard of rooms and corridors. Inner ring harbors are not a Minoan idiom. A third knot is materials and beasts. Plato lists white, black, and red stone, and adds, and elephants in plenty. The stones are plausible enough. Mixtures of limestone, tuffs, dark volcanics occur widely in the Aegean, and such a triad of colors could be had. Elephants are another matter. There are no elephants as part of the Bronze Age Mediterranean environment. Dwarf island species vanished earlier, though ivory as a trade good is common. Minoan scenes teem with bulls, goats, lions, fish, dolphins, but not elephants in the landscape. It's not a killer argument, just a reminder of genre. Plato, composing his city image, salts it with exotica that would strike the listener brilliant metal, an exotic animal, a gleaming temple. Fourth is law and oath. In Critias, the Atlantean kings convene every 5th and 6th year in alternation. Take a bull, sacrifice to Poseidon, swear at a pillar of orichalcum. Minoan life includes solemn rites, horns of consecration, offerings, dances, bull leaping. What it lacks is a clear oath league of 10 houses, as in Plato's narrative. True, we know the constitutions of the Bronze Age poorly. Palace archives burned, and those that survive speak more of rosters, grain, and labor than of legal philosophy. Still, even where sources whisper 10 houses of Poseidon remain a Platonic instrument. Minoan ties are broader and subtler. The palace is a network node. Power and exchange are distributed. Control is built on logistics as much as on oaths. Now the dynamics of collapse. Plato ends at the strike, one day and night. The Aegean tells a story of a long unraveling. After Thera, time passes. Parts of harbors and villages recover. But around mid-2nd millennium, BCE, Mycenaean presence rises on Crete. Palaces suffer fires and rebuilds. Minoan turns to Minoan Mycenaean, then to Mycenaean outright. Not a sudden end, but a sequence of blows and restructurings, natural shock, logistical crisis, political restitching. A neighbor occupies the floor above you, and then your own. Only in the end, when the flesh of the network has thinned, come ruins. This many-episode night translates Plato's one day and night into real history. Very well storm, wave, economic break, outside administration, but still leaves us with mismatches of place and form. And yet, read attentively, the hypothesis pays dividends. It teaches us not to burn for a simple yes, no, but to watch how memory of disaster becomes a story legible to elites. To a 4th century Greek, talk of a terrible eruption, a shifted, water and bread calendar, empty keys, whispers of someone came with sword and seal. All of it was recognizable. Plato needed no lies. He could load one basket with familiar stones. Sea, palaces, money, fire, water, someone else's stamp. The image of Atlantis thereby gained weight. That is the strong side of the Minoan explanation. It shows how a philosopher borrows living pieces to weave a didactic composition. There is also a homely layer of likeness, drainage, and plumbing. Akrotiri offers a stunning picture. Pipes, outlets, fall gradients, wash basins, the sort of thing often mistaken for wonders of a late civilization. But in truth, Bronze Age practical engineering. Plato mentions hot and cold springs in Atlantis, baths and basins. Santorini breathes geothermal heat. Crete breathes springs. Marry that to the craft of gathering water in stone, and you get the materiality of Plato's phrase. This is a match not only in words, but in hands. How to hold a clay pipe, how to set a run so water falls by itself. The hypothesis weakens when turned into a puzzle solved with a triumphant, "We've found it." The usual 3-step trick runs like this. Draw circles on a satellite image of a caldera, call them harbors, relocate beyond the pillars to beyond the limits of our imagination. Overlay this Cretias plan on any round coast. Beautiful on a screen, unfair to both text and sea. A circle by itself is not a harbor, and a harbor without work against surf is a short-lived thrill. The conscientious version says instead, Yes, the Minoan world is a vivid ethnographic repository for Plato. Yes, the Thera eruption is a powerful clue to how the instantaneous layer of memory forms. But no, this does not entail Atlantis × Crete or Atlantis × Santorini. It entails that Plato likely tailored familiar fabrics for his stage. One more thread: the relationship between Athens and Crete in late Bronze and early classical Greek imagination. Crete is old, skillful, wealthy, hiding labyrinths and secrets. Athens is the proud right and order of a younger city. The trope, the small versus the great, sits easily in school memory. The opposition of Athenians and lords of the sea is part of the cultural set on which Plato mounts his play. Even if his sea power dwells beyond the strait, not at Knossos, the music is already in the air, thanks to Cretan motifs playing for centuries on the Athenian stage of myth and theater. That explains why Minoan Atlantis returns so persistently. The sound is there. You only need to sing along. There is epistemic value, too. The hypothesis forces us to listen to the archaeology of catastrophe. Thera is legible not just in the crater. It reads in ceramic change, in destruction layers, in a smeared trade geography, in new paths taken by metal, wine, and oil. The lesson is practical. Large systems don't fall like this, but like this. Memory of a fall likes to compress scenes into a single impact shot, hence a therapeutic takeaway for reading Plato. Seeing the shot, think about the edit. What of other candidates within the same sea that sometimes substitute for Crete and Santorini? The Cyclades are generous with circles, caldera lagoons, dune arcs. Yet somewhere it is the eternal swell, elsewhere a lack of fresh water, elsewhere slopes too steep. Plato's harbor logic dissolves. In the Levant, strips exist where 2 crops are routine, but rings are not the language of the shore. Any sweet candidate in the Aegean drags the same questions. Where are the arsenals? Where is the large hydraulic web? Where is the throat the sea won't choke every winter? And these are hard to answer without stretching. In fairness, note one more thing. Plato writes the outer sea, not only as geography, but as a stage of a different measure. The ocean is breadth and otherness. Outside Greek order, the Mediterranean is the room. It is easier to send Atlantis out the door to speak of a foreign regime of power. Minoans are 2 hours, their model already sewn into elite daily life. This is psychological, not geographic, but it matters if we read Plato as a literary statesman. A midway sum. Strengths of the Minoan Atlantis. Enormous materiality of Bronze Age life and engineering, drainage, stores, roads, shipbuilding, that resonates with Plato's descriptions. A real, large-scale natural catastrophe, Thera, that can explain the instant in cultural memory. A sea network and wealth that give weight to talk of power. A convenient school for understanding how images from real disasters become a didactic composition. Weaknesses. Geography, beyond the Pillars, does not align with the Aegean. The capitals form in Plato is concentric. Minoan cities are terraced and planar. The oath at the pillar and the League of 10 Houses are Platonic tools, not a Minoan constitution. Plato's one day and night is a punch cut, while the Aegean shows a serial crisis. Even with those caveats, the Minoan angle serves our main aim, to read Atlantis so we don't mistake a lesson for a sensation. If we hold to discipline text, water, engineering, time, we can suppose that Plato abstracted from recent history a typical drama, a waterborne power rich in resources, entranced with itself, takes natural and political blows, loses measure, and the net unravels. A type is not an address. It is material for a parable, not coordinates. From here, it makes sense to widen the map and look at other traces of Atlantis. The west of Iberia and old Tartessos with metals and a restless delta. Atlantic island arcs and shelves with their ring lagoons. Far-flung versions about new worlds and Antarctica, and to walk them with the same checklist. Where the shore fits, where the water lives, where archaeology rises to a Bronze Age port city, and where what we have is a picture without a machine room. That is not a hunt or a debunking, but a calm craft in which the myth remains an image and the world a field for checks. V. Other traces. From Iberia to the New World. When the Minoan explanation feels too inward-looking, too securely inside the Mediterranean, eyes swing westward, to where the ocean truly begins, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. 3 magnetic fields appear at once. The southwest of Iberia, with its ancient Tartessos, the island arcs of the Canaries, Madeira, and the Azores, whose volcanic rings tease the imagination. And, farther out, romantic projections onto the Bahamas, Antarctica, and other vanished lands. We will walk this chart not as sensation hunters, but with a ruler and a notebook. Shore, water, wind, sand, stone, labor, time. Wherever the myth helps, it nudges us to ask dull questions. Wherever it becomes bait, it coaxes us not to ask them. We will try to hold to the first habit. Begin with the place most often called the reasonable candidate, the lower Guadalquivir and the old marshlands around today's Doñana. Classical authors locate here Tartessos, a wealthy zone of copper and silver, salt and purple dye, early Phoenician ties, legendary kings and songs now lost. The picture is charming. Beyond the pillars, a river mouth, a delta that for millennia wandered spinning off islands and spits, lagoons and channels. From orbit you see circles and crescents, sandbars that promise inner water. Trade was loud here. Local power could grow on metal and salt. Fresh water rises in wells almost beside the sea. Nature herself seems to ask us to sketch ringed harbors and declare Atlantis found. Sorting the shelves, the charm fades into work. First, islandness. A delta is a trickster. Today a peninsula. Tomorrow, a chain of low islets. The next day, a continuous shoal. Only the main channel keeps its face. Plato's large island with mountains and a broad plain is not the grammar of a delta. Second, ring harbors. In low deltas, tides and surf ceaselessly remodel the throat of any lagoon. Without routine dredging and retaining works, a navigable ring chokes in a handful of storm seasons. Third, scale. Plato's capital spans a few kilometers from outer rings to the central hill. Photogenic delta circles are either too small, toy lagoons, or too large, wide limans and lakes. And in neither case is there a throat one could keep navigable for centuries. Fourth, stone and metal. Iberia has ores aplenty. Limestones and red sandstones give you the white-red dark palette. But Bronze Age harbor masonry and arsenals under cover on Plato's scale tend to be later phenomena. Earlier works were timber and sand affairs, real but fragile and hard to see. Finally, water. 2 harvests a year are plausible in the Atlantic climate of southwestern Spain, but then we must expect canals, ditches, revetments, sluice habits, the hydraulic language Plato writes from inside. That language has to be in the ground, not merely in the eye. To be fair, Tartessos is a first-rate school in reading with the shore. It teaches you to tell island from bar, harbor from pretty circle, abundance of water from marsh that will take a new course next year. It proves that beyond the pillars truly means beyond, but does not therefore mean there and only there. It reminds us that a wealthy ancient coast is not Plato's Atlantis, simply because it has a river, metal, and early traders. Tartessos Pharnain Atlantis is a poor equation, but fine training. Now the island arcs, the Canaries, Madeira, the Azores, just the names conjure volcanic rings, calderas, black slopes, white foam, green terraces. Each arc has coves where rock backs break the wave, and berths hide behind the spine. Geothermal hints feed tales of hot springs. Outcrops give a three-toned stone palette. The climate offers two harvests, if there is water and terracing. The checklist looks promising. Yet here, too, you must keep a workshop in mind, not a shop window. The central problem of the arcs is height and steepness. A volcanic coast is a sliced loaf, narrow ledges and a drop into deep water. Beautiful and snug for anchorages, poor for concentric basins. Without a reef bar or a heavy mole, which the Bronze Age did not build. Any inner water is short-lived. Next is surf and sand. The open Atlantic hammers these mouths. Every entrance must be tight and sheltered. Calderas suggest rings on water, but the first real storm fills the doorway with cobble and sand. Third is the urban body. Plato's capital is walkable, a port city machine where ringed harbors, arsenals, and all the gear serve thousands. On steep volcanic ledges, you get ladders and mule paths, good for communities, less congruent with a ringed port capital's logistics. The Azores often seem the most cooperative, farther out to sea, rounder calderas, a satellite view that almost draws Atlantis for you. Two hard councils push back. The outer ocean is colder and heavier, with rougher wind and current. Building and maintaining heavy stone works. There is dearer and harder. And the archaeological silence. If a Platonic capital had stood here, at least the bones of its engineering, the language of stone and timber should peep through, even scraps, but in the right shapes. So far, the record is quiet. Where archaeology is quiet, desire tends to speak too loudly. There is a subtler argument against volcano Atlantis, the river logic. Plato's city lives in water springs, baths, irrigation channels, water everywhere, the hydraulics of everyday life. Volcanic arcs can store water in lava and tuff, but to turn that into a broad plain with two crops is the craft of populous generations. Terraces, walls, discipline. For the Bronze Age, such dense garden carpentry leaves stout traces. On these arcs, those traces are scarce or young. The mineral picture seduces, the water budget demurs. Farther afield lie the showy versions, Bahamian shelves with stone roads, Antarctica as a continent shifted and iced, Atlantean messages hidden in early modern maps. These are hard to resist because the bolder the hypothesis, the brighter the moment of discovery. They are exactly where our dull questions are most needed. The Bahamas are shelf world, carbonate platforms, ramps, shoals, stair steps of depth, where the sea plays as it wishes. A paved road on a shoal is often a beach rock ledge or recent human stonework. On shelves, forms endure for years or decades, rarely centuries. Warehouses, arsenals, harbors, those are languages carbonate sand does not love. This is why cities under the sea crumble on the first test of sea level curves and dates. Better to say plainly, magnificent theaters of waves, poor archives for ancient ports. Antarctica is beloved of inverted solutions, the continent that slid and iced over after catastrophe. Geology smiles and shrugs. Plate motion, ice cores, isotopes, tables, not romances, compose a timescale of very long processes. One day and night does not glue onto those scales. Plato did not need Antarctica. He needed an outer world as a stage for a different regime of power. To export the parable to the poles would hide it where no citizen could walk in thought. Early modern maps deserve a song of their own. Margins teem with phantom islands, currents, mirages, hypotheses mingled with mariners' talk. Overlay Cretias on any round blotch, and you can republish Atlantis on schedule. The cure is the same as before. Source versus interpretation. The source is Plato, his words, measures, metaphors. Interpretation is everything we add after seeing a circle on parchment. Between them lies ground geomorphology and archaeology. Until the ground speaks, interpretation must remain modest. This is not an invitation to boredom, but a lesson in professional curiosity. Underwater archaeology, geophysics, geomorphology. These do not kill the myth. They befriend it to the extent that the myth asks us to think better. Side-scan sonar sketches, shorelines, and shelf breaks. Cores tell what the seabed breathed and when. Magnetometers pick up anchors and chains. LiDAR skims the shallows, revealing buried trenches. In this optic, Atlantis stops being a single sensation and becomes a bundle of questions. Where were the major Bronze Age ports on the Atlantic facades of Europe and Africa? What did their harbors look like? What did surf do to them? How did sea level move? How far did pre-Phoenician sea nets reach? Where do we look for arsenals? Where for factories on land? Iberia, Morocco, the thresholds of Mauritania, the coasts of Brittany and Cornwall. Everywhere the sea has a back, a headland, and a belly, a protected basin. Archaeology finds traces of anchorages, workshops, mines, salt works, shrines. Sometimes it's a handful of sherds and bone, sometimes a mole underwater, sometimes a promontory town with a working side tucked from wind and swell, and a parade side facing open sea. In such places, you sometimes feel an urge to say, "Here is Atlantis." The moment you add Plato's scale-ringed basins, arsenals, irrigation web, two-harvest plain, or a calcum sheen good sense, cools the hand. Ports. Yes. Waterside societies used to meddle, yes. A ringed capital machine unlikely. Why do big mistakes flourish on the shelf? Because the shelf is a gifted conjurer. It draws circles as if by compass. It lays out stone rows that look like walls. It shows paths of flat plates that are natural joints. It shuffles sand so that yesterday's city is gone tomorrow, ready to be refound nearby. Add the night pallor of sonar stills and a line like, "Scientists suppress the truth," and a sensation writes itself. The antidote is dull, dating, comparison with known natural forms. A second, look a year later after the shelf has recut the picture, admission of error. The myth loses no power. It sheds cheap applause. There is a mirror error, brushing everything aside. Archaeologists and sailors, tired of sensationalism, sometimes say, "There is nothing there." That's false, too. Along Atlantic Europe and Africa, in great river mouths, behind barrier islands, and in lagoons, lies a wealth of honest, gripping history. Chains of bronze and early Iron Age ports, metal and salt, exchange and shrines that face the water. Not Atlantis, but real. They speak more truthfully about sea and measure than any satellite circle. To tie this chapter back to our larger task, gather a single checklist by which any Atlantis, from Iberia to the Bahamas, should pass or fail. Geography. A real island with mountain back and broad plain, not a spit or a delta living on days. Water. Strong natural springs, plus an artificial language of channels, basins, diversions. Traces Earth loves to keep. Harbors. Construction sheltered from surf, with a throat that winter does not choke each time. The inner water lived in, not sketched. Material. 3 stones are normal in many coasts. Look for them in masonry, not just in quarry. Metal. Orichalcum is rhetorical shine. The real base is copper, tin, lead, iron. Those leave trails. Scale. Rings and canals measured in stadia kilometers, not tens of meters. Toy geometry is a no. Time. 9,000 years is rhetoric. Let landforms dictate their own dates. Method. Repeatability outranks the first thrilling photo. What is this for? To train our eyes. A strong myth demands disciplined seeing. It asks us to notice what pleases and what resists. It sends us into the ocean not for a secret, but for a skill. Holding a course, reading a sea, respecting sand, listening to stone. To say beautiful, but no. Close, but does not cohere. Interesting. Let's check with another instrument. That is Atlantis's benefit. It helps us separate source from interpretation, possible from wishful, shore from the picture of a shore. A few candid admissions for dessert. Yes, the ocean keeps much we have not seen. Yes, drowned valleys and old riverbeds run off beyond us, and now and then the sea returns, a keystone, a mast, a wall course. Yes, Atlantic storms and moving sands sweep away what held yesterday. Precisely for that reason, an honest conversation with the ocean is long. It has no one day and night. It has years, seasons, repetitions. If one day we do find a city underwater with ringed harbors, channels and arsenals, old basins, and the language of stone and timber craftwork, the myth will not die. It will smile. You read me correctly. We met in the middle, honestly. The next chapter returns us to the starting point. Plato is a thinker for whom Atlantis is first of all an allegory of hubris, of form unmoored and measure fatigued. We have toured the candidates and learned to ask shore and water their hard questions. Now we ask the text, what else does it want from us besides maps? How does it tune a reader to talk about the state, wealth, pride, and fall? Allegory, not instead of geography, but alongside it, is our next step. 6. Plato's allegory, a lesson in hubris and how a city holds together. At the center of Plato's Atlantis story lies not geography, but the craft of governing strength. He uses the sea power beyond the pillars as a stage on which to test what happens to a city, its people and its institutions, when resources come in a flood. The experiment is simple and still uncomfortable. Give a polity metals, grain, timber, ships, victories, everything at once, and watch what follows if these gifts are managed not by measure, but by appetite. The answer is hubris, self-expansion without limits, followed by political and moral fraying. In Timaeus and Critias, this is not preached. It is built into the architecture of the tale. Ancient Athens, trained by education and law, withstands a trial. Atlantis, initially disciplined, lets the glitter of wealth outshine measure and begins to hollow out from within. Plato leans on several key ideas. First is measure, metron. Measure is not hair-shirt austerity, it is proportionality. Publicly, it means law that tames the surges of the strong, and education, paideia, that turns restraint into habit. Privately, it is the learned sense of enough. Atlantis begins in measure. 10 royal houses convene at fixed intervals, swear on an orichalcum pillar, sacrifice a bull, renew their common law. Over time, the shell remains, and the consent inside it ebbs. Plato marks the tipping point in plain language. The mortal admixture grows, the ritual still runs, but the inner discipline that gives it force has thinned. The city's walls, docks, and arsenals still shine. The substance and obedience to limits has gone soft. Second is paideia as a technology of the state. Plato does not romanticize nature. He builds a system in which training outweighs talent. Children of elites and commoners alike learn steadiness, courage without rashness, generosity without waste, power without pique. Education is not a contest of knowledge. It is the shaping of character. So when he contrasts Athens and Atlantis, it is not smart versus stupid. It is habituated to measure versus unmoored by surplus. His homely image could be a line at a counter, a citizen who waits because the rule says so, and a magnate who cuts because he can. Multiply that by court, market, and army, and you get regime dynamics. Third is hubris. Here it is not a theological sin so much as a social defect, acting above one's measure, taking the public for private, gathering beyond one's capacity to steward, muting dissent with volume and rank. Hubris looks like power in the short run. It accelerates processes, lights up parades, but like any overload, it stresses the beams. Plato's is an engineer's morality. A bridge built for a load will fail if you drive a column across all lanes forever. A city built for counterweights will fail if you make exceptions the rule. The punishment of the gods that approaches at the end of Critias is not a caprice. It is the return of feedback, the world saying, enough, when no one else will. Fourth is the proportion between technique and character. Plato revels in Atlantis's engineering canals, causeways, basins, arsenals. He understands that technique is power. It multiplies output and scale. But technique is an amplifier, not a governor. It magnifies the motives in charge. If a city is careful, technique enlarges prudence. Irrigation carries water to pastures. Roads carry goods without theft. Foundries turn ore into tools and arms. If a city is swollen with hubris, technique multiplies. The swelling canals are dug for spectacle. Arsenals become showrooms. Roads serve as clamps for other towns. The comparison with Athens is built to force that question. Not whose kit is bigger, but whose kit serves better ends. Fifth is ritual as protocol. In Atlantis, the kings meet by rule, hunt a bull, sacrifice, swear at a pillar where the law is engraved. Ceremony here is not magic, but a public operating procedure. It makes power visible, law tangible, and oath a shared fact. Plato's sting is that procedures can go hollow. The hunt remains, the oath is recited, the pillar gleams, and yet the restraint that once animated it is gone. The remedy is neither cynicism nor pageantry, but supervision and cadence, calendars, audits, first function, then ribbon. Ritual must be welded to consequence, or it becomes the mask that a failing order wears to bed. Sixth is right scale. Plato's capital is graspable space you could traverse in a day. That is not antiquarian trivia. It is a claim that systems work when effects are visible to those responsible for them. Growth without measure is not only about money, it is about size beyond feedback. Atlantis grows until it can no longer see itself. Athens wins because it is small in the sense of self-governable, not in the sense of weak. Seventh is memory. In the frame story, Egyptian priests chide Solon. Greek cities are children because fire and flood keep erasing their records. Memory laws, archives, cautionary tales is infrastructure. Atlantis at first remembers well law, calendars, oaths, but in time swaps the memory of craft for the memory of spectacle. Plato's Egyptian move is not exoticism. It is a lesson. Honor old ledgers and old schools, or you will spend your strength relearning what the dead were ready to teach. Bring these pieces down to the ground, and the allegory stays practical. Where does measure fail in practice? 4 arenas recur. Courts. When the rich boast that justice is in the bag, dual codes replace common law. Markets, when, for show, we display fair weights, while for us we shave them. Trust, the city's quietest capital, depreciates. Armies, when service becomes a stage for bravado, not vigilance and drill. The force confuses holiday with function. Cults and festivals, when a city's rites no longer rehearse shared limits, but drown them in noise. Common sense leaves the square. Atlantis is vulnerable because it confuses brilliance with rightness. We are great. Therefore, we are correct. The relation between external war and internal order is similar. Discipline wins wars. Drunk armies lose them. External pressure, if the city is well trained, tightens form. If it is lax, it normalizes emergency loud decisions in place of systems. Plato's cure is familiar and seldom applied. Prepare for peace as for war as for peace. Keep the army an instrument, not therapy for hubris. None of this makes Plato an enemy of pleasure or energy. He distinguishes between delight as restorative and delight as anesthetic. In the Athenian canon, joy is civic hygiene. In the Atlantean version, it is a cushion pressed over alarms. The lesson is modern. Entertainment is safe when it restores. Dangerous when it replaces deliberation. Seen in today's language of systems, the allegory is almost diagrammatic. Cities are systems with many inputs and slow outputs. Hubris is a refusal of systems thinking. I want. That's enough. Translate Plato's terms, and you get a checklist. Measure becomes institutional limits, independent courts, transparent procedures, bounded mandates. Paideia becomes education for responsibility, delayed gratification, argument, accountability. Ritual becomes public cadence, reports, hearings, calendars. Technique becomes accelerant, platforms, money, logistics that needs a regulator. One day and night becomes any compound failure, grid blackout, market panic, infrastructure cascade. The gods are feedbacks we ignore at our cost. From here, Plato's Small Athens versus Great Atlantis reads as design guidance. Embed many small Athens inside large states districts, independent courts, autonomous universities, local councils, places where results are visible and rules are close to situations. The more such nodes, the harder it is for a whole system to slide into a glossy yet brittle Atlantis. A few concrete mini-scenarios fix the point. Harbor on paper. A render shows ringed basins, cafes, yachts. The Platonic reader asks 4 things. Where are surf and silt? Who keeps the throat clear? Whence fresh water? And where do rains go? What cadence and accountability govern maintenance? Clear answers turn a picture into a project. Vague ones signal a rotunda on sand, accelerated school. Rankings and medals abound. The Platonic question is paideia. Where do students learn to wait, to hear dissent, to stand behind a signature? Speed without character produces fast failure. Smart city. Sensors, cameras, drones, AI. The Platonic question is rails for power. Where are the independent brakes on tweaking the system for the few? What are publication rules? Which slow organs, archives, libraries, courts anchor the speed? Without them, smart becomes an overclocked Atlantis. The tone matters. It is easy to read Atlantis as a doom poster and use it to scold indefinitely. Plato writes to convert hope into practice. His claim is modest and hard. Large systems live by small, repeated acts. Honest cues, dull audits, public hearings that happen on time, laws that bind especially the strong. Measure is not punishment. It extends joy. Ritual is not boredom. It lubricates machinery. Memory is not drag. It is a map. Technique is not a foe. It is a force that needs a governor. Small Athens is not parochialism. It is the geometry of control out of which durable greatness is built. Read this way: Atlantis ceases to be a compass for a treasure hunt and becomes a mirror for systems. Not, where are the coordinates? But where is our conscience? In that mirror, anyone can take a ruler to the layers. How thick is speech and shine? How thick are rules and habits? The next day, one dull thing can be done. Finish the protocol, fix the drain, carry a dispute to court, accept the unglamorous correct decision. No sensation attends that work. But that is precisely where a myth does its serious job. It helps us be adults. 7th, the long life of the myth, from the Renaissance to pop culture. At times, Atlantis seems to outlive every city precisely because it never has to repair its walls. It is raised out of words, images, and the rituals of reading maps. Each age moors it in whatever harbor floats the newest vessels. Humanist treatises, scientific journals, occult pamphlets, cinema, and games. What Plato forged as a philosophical backdrop for thinking about measure keeps returning as a stage for experiments in imagination, a showroom for peddlers of sensation, and a mirror in which societies examine their own anxieties about arrogance, collapse, and forgetfulness. Let's trace how the languages of Atlantis shift from Renaissance studies to streaming services, and why the myth has not dissolved into mere entertainment. Begin with the Renaissance. Humanists teach Europe to read the ancients not as idols, but as living interlocutors. Plato comes back to the desk in Greek and Latin, and Timaeus with Critias is heard again. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules now sounds different. Voyages widen the maritime picture. Discoveries promise concrete correspondences where once only question marks stood. Cartographers cautiously frame Atlantic islands. Thinkers, like Thomas More and Francis Bacon, refresh the language of utopia, a place that is nowhere, useful for modeling law and order. For More, an island is a thought experiment in commonwealth. For Bacon, the new Atlantis is a state-run house of knowledge. The point is not equating these with Plato's tale, but learning a form. The island is a bench model on which to show how to live. The Renaissance thus reminds us that a myth can be a teaching tool, not a treasure chart. Baroque encyclopedists and early natural philosophers turn Atlantis into an explanatory plug for gaps in knowledge. Where maps and histories misfit, a sunken bridge between peoples is handy. Skepticism grows in parallel. Early geology begins to read mountains and coasts as the writing of deep time millions of years that don't welcome one-night catastrophes. While faculties recalibrate to the age of the earth, a romantic Atlantis, a letter from a lost golden age, circulates in salons and cheap print. In the 19th century, industrial presses democratize reading. Newspapers and magazines nurture an audience that wants both science and wonder. A market for sensation appears, and Atlantis becomes a standing column. It explains pyramids one year, dams the next, pantheons and alphabets after that, while ancient sea routes lace the globe on woodcut maps. The scholarly eye sees classic methodological traps, late data pushed into early texts, sources swapped for interpretations, matches amassed without reckoning odds. The popular ear hears a different chord. If a great civilization vanished, we are fragile too. If all could be lost in a blink, so could we. Myth as productive anxiety. On the same shelf sprout occult versions. They replace Plato with private cosmologies, telling of root races and memories open to the elect. These Atlanteans own crystal cities and gifted children with far hearing. Temples float. Timelines stretch beyond critique. The mechanism is transparent. What sells is not knowledge, but access. Myth as password. Against this, the historian's voice matters. Absence of coordinates is not a license to invent. Every picture of the past owes a bill for sources and method. The 20th century adds two powerful engines: science fiction and cinema. Jules Verne plants in mass imagination the scene of a drowned colonnade, no matter, where the city stood. The beam of a lamp crosses water and catches a mute statue. The unforgettable image of beauty eaten by the sea migrates through comics, adventures, and later animation. Thanks to the screen, a myth that once worked through argument now works through eyes. Audiences see the city without a shard of archaeology behind the frame. A new grammar follows. Atlantis as a technopolis, where devices either save or doom. As an undersea realm whose heroes speak with the ocean. As a colony that survived a catastrophe. Each genre shades it differently. Romance, politics, utopia, apocalypse. Meanwhile, a scientific revolution redraws the ground. Geology makes peace with physics and chemistry. Continents ride plates. Oceans open and close. Sea levels rise and fall on 1,000 and million-year scales. The model dislikes mid-ocean continents sinking in one night. Underwater archaeology matures. Sonar sketches, shelves, magnetometers pick up anchors. Divers bring up datable ceramic, timber, rope. Drowned ports tend to be children of slow sea rise and shifting coasts, not single hammer blows. The myth remains as art, but literal claims dim. Late 20th century culture embraces homemade sensation, TV mysteries, glossy curiosity magazines, covers with floating temples. Honest curiosity lives there alongside stock errors. Pretty coincidences are gathered as arguments. Sources are late maps without provenance. Fuzzy photos carry the wrong scales. Eyewitness testimony floats free of checking. Edits and music manufacture the feel of almost found. The viewer's defense is simple. Demand method. Where is the map? Whence the date? What is the counter-hypothesis? How likely is the coincidence? Could this material survive underwater that long? When the answers blur, confidence drops. By contrast, resilient programs admit uncertainty and resist painting questions into correct pictures. Plato's unfinished Critias, Zeus poised to speak, then silence, is a good teacher of such restraint. The economy of legend deserves frankness. A market surrounds Atlantis tourism, souvenirs, theme parks, documentaries. It is not malicious. People crave wonder and will pay for crafted amazement. There is no fault if promises stay modest. Do not claim proven or found where you offer narrative. Commerce can be honest. Show Bronze Age Atlantic ports. Lead visitors through river mouths and submerged museums where pithoi and anchors lie. Give them the sea-worn texture of real history. Where that is done, myth gains. It puts feet on the ground and ceases to be an endless teaser. There are darker uses, and we should name them. In the 20th century, ideologies tried to recruit Atlantis as ancestry to justify superiority or territorial claims. This is dangerous. It turns imaginary geography into real programs of exclusion. Plato's remedy is to recall his purpose. Atlantis is a moral diagram, not a pedigree. Make myth a passport, and you trade knowledge for force. Whenever you hear that all greatness came from there, therefore we are best, the right reply is brief. Show your method, not your slogan. Why does the myth not die even as science removes its chance at literal mid-ocean continents vanishing overnight? Because it speaks to things that don't need geology. The habits of wealth, the self-assurance of the strong, the cost of forgetting. It also offers a rare composition-sharp city geometry. Rings, canals, a temple, a market, and at once an open horizon, beyond the pillars. That openness lets each era retune the myth. In the steam age, it was a sunken laboratory. In the radio age, a voice of the past. In the digital age, missing data in the system. In climate talk, a warning about expensive surplus. Finally, the myth survives because it is convenient for household morals. It says that a rich house can burn from its own wiring, that ritual is not masquerade but maintenance, that small Athens can beat great Atlantis, not because small is prettier, but because governability lasts longer than overdrive. This language is clear to a schoolchild and useful in a minister's office. For the first, a verse about not everything, not at once. For the second, a charter for procedures that dislike cameras. When a teacher, engineer, or mayor takes the word Atlantis to explain why dull things, reports, rules, cues matter, they are using the myth properly. Long life does not mean endless youth. It means endurance. Atlantis persists not by being rediscovered each season, but by being readable as a manual of sobriety. The Renaissance exhibited the island as a model of virtue. The Enlightenment demanded method. Romantics mourned the cost of loss. Scientists told the story of a slow Earth and fast coasts. Pop culture voiced contemporary fears in accessible images. Wherever the myth does not pretend to be a fact, it serves. Wherever it claims to be fact, it becomes carnival soon, replaced by a new mask. Picture a small seaside museum for a worthy ending to this chapter. On one wall, Plato's ringed plan. Beside it, a Bronze Age port model with moles, stores, and an arsenal. Further, a sonar profile of the bay showing old channels. A screen loops interviews with an archaeologist and a pilot. On a table, a card reads, "Questions without answers." That room has everything: image, craft, instrument, voice, and modesty. In such a room, Atlantis neither quarrels with science nor flirts with charlatanry. It stands where it belongs, a parable that helps us keep measure. Bait, conclusions, and uses. Why this myth matters. Take Atlantis apart and put it back together, and you don't get a missing island. You get a tool that keeps three hard-to-balance pieces in the same frame: a vivid picture, a strict method, and a simple ethic. The picture rings, canals, harbor mouths, a temple, and a market keeps us close to people in their ordinary days. The method shore, water, stone, dates, keeps us from letting the picture drift into fable. The ethic measure against self-confidence keeps talk practical when the map runs out. This closing chapter gathers those threads into workable guidance. How to read Atlantis so that it sharpens our sight. How to separate inspiring imagination from risky invention. What use the myth has for a city, a school, a firm. And why a very old story sounds current in debates about infrastructure, platforms, climate, and spectacle. 1. Be honest about genre. Atlantis is not a dispatch or a survey. It is a philosophical scene built with plausible materials. That is its value. A parable can say what a case study cannot. It shows temptation and limit without distracting names and addresses. So when you meet "We found Atlantis," agree first on the game being played. If the speaker signs their claims with sources, dates, sections, and counter-arguments, you are in the realm of hypothesis. If they trade in "Look, it resembles," you are in the realm of theater. Both can be worthwhile. Mixing them breeds confusion and makes good minds easy prey for showmanship. 2. Keep to the four supports: text, geography, water, engineering. It is a portable discipline. Any grand plan, a port, A tech district, a bridge to the future, can be squeezed through those supports. Read the text. What exactly is promised and in what language? Lay it on the land. Where? With what neighbors? With what constraints? Lay it on the water. What resources flow in and out? Money, people, energy, and what seasonal limits they obey. Lay it on the works. Who builds? Out of what? To what standard? With what maintenance cadence? Where the four hold, proceed. Where two sag, slow down. That is not anti-vision. It is how you keep one day and night inside novels, not budgets. 3. Practice measure at small scales. Plato's warning is not wealth corrupts. It is surplus unmanaged by limits phrase systems. You see it first where no one thinks to look. A queue, a filing deadline, a lane politely yielded, a signature honored. Every exception carved for the strong weakens the habit that lets a city move without shouting. The cure is not slogans. It is 1,000 small, boring acts performed on time by people with names. A clerk, a judge, a teacher, a dispatcher. They save more cities from Atlantis than any grand speech. 4. Respect ritual as protocol. The bull, the oath, the pillar are not decorations. They are procedures. Calendar, audit, report, vote. When they empty out, when ribbons precede function, when accountability is staged, when documents ratify decisions made elsewhere, the shell remains and the discipline evaporates. The fix is prosaic. Independent checks, public cadences. The rule, first it works, then we cut a ribbon. That is what binds form back to substance. 5. Treat memory as infrastructure. The priest's jab at Solon, your cities are children, has modern bite. Memory is minutes, ledgers, archives, tests, what not to do. Without it, each generation pays again for old mistakes. Every innovation becomes reinvent the wheel. Publish data. Keep awkward postmortems. Record how you decided, not just what. In schools, teach how to read a source and how to doubt a diagram. Then, 9,000 years becomes not a number that dazzles, but a question you can ask fairly. 6. Remember that technique is an amplifier. Platforms, sensors, logistics, money. None of them makes us better. They make us louder. If a system is measured, technique extends its reach. If a system is swollen, technique multiplies its hubris. The management task is to bolt brakes onto power, clear publication rules, recourse and appeals, protected slow organs, archives, libraries, courts that don't dazzle but hold the long line. 7. Stay within a governable scale. Small Athens defeats great Atlantis, not because small is cute, but because feedback works at that size. Large states can simulate that virtue by embedding many small, accountable units, districts, courts, universities, councils, with real teeth. The more small Athens inside a system, the harder it is for the glossy outer shell to become brittle. 8. Train imagination. Don't muzzle it. The image is strong because it is beautiful. Keep it and pair it with questions. In class, let students draw the ringed city, then ask how the swell comes through the throat of the harbor. In museums, set a shining orichalcum plate beside a label that says, alloy, metaphor, we argue. In media, enjoy the rendering and ask for a map, a method, an author. That is not the death of wonder. It is how wonder grows up. 9. Be wary of lost greatness. A drowned paradise is the easiest lightning rod for present disappointment. They had it right. We must leap back or forward at once. Plato's counsel is steadier. Not a leap, but craft measure, protocol, memory, scale. Fast returns often profit hubris. Slow progress builds channels, hearings, honest courts, dependable services, the boring girders that matter the hour a storm arrives. 10. Diagnose weak joints. Atlantis teaches repair. Where are exceptions routine? Where does speed reliably displace correctness? Where do for us and for all diverge? Fix those joints quietly. Move a signal. Clean a drain. Duplicate an archive. Rewrite a form so that the strong cannot slip through without leaving a mark. End of the world usually starts as end of maintenance. 3 short use cases fix the idea. Harbor project. Lovely rings on a render. Ask surf, silt, throat, water budget, maintenance cadence. Good answers turn CGI into a key. Bad ones leave you with a pavilion on sand, accelerated curriculum, medals promised. Ask where students learn to wait, hear dissent, sign and stand by the signature. Speed without character is a fast failure. Smart city. Sensors everywhere. Ask for rails, external audit, publication by default, due process for errors. Slow anchors, archives, libraries, courts. Otherwise, you have an overclocked Atlantis that looks marvelous until the first storm. The tone matters. It is easy to wield Atlantis as a scold. Plato's tone is drier and kinder. Make hope practical. Measure is not penance. It prolongs joy. Ritual is not theater. It is lubrication. Memory is not drag. It is a map. Technique is not an enemy. It is a force that needs a governor. Small Athens is not provincial. It is the geometry of control out of which durable greatness is built. If you want one sentence to pin above the desk, take this. Atlantis is a mirror in which we test not coordinates, but the conscience of systems. In it you can measure layers, how thick the speech and shine, how thick the rules and habits. You can notice where you are, Atlantean, strong and impulsive, and where you are, Athenian, predictable, and a little dull. The next day you can do one dull thing. Finish a protocol, fix a drain, carry a dispute to court, accept the unglamorous right decision. No fanfare attends that work. But that is where the myth does its adult job. So let every city have its pillar with the oath, a deadline board, a public ledger, a rule that does not bend to a call. Let every district house its small Athens, a library, a court, a school, a museum, a council where it is unexciting but binding. Let every firm keep a compact that caps bulges of power and logs exceptions. Let each of us learn to check a picture against water and stone, and to respect the boring. Then Atlantis stays in books, a fine parable of someone else's end, and stops whispering cues for our own. We have walked from Plato through maps, shores, hypotheses, cinema, and civic habits. We did not find an island, and that is just as well. We needed the discipline of sight that the island trains. Seeing shore, hearing water, touching stone, respecting time. The ringed city can live in memory as a reminder. Glitter without measure is only light on a wave, and it sinks first. Keep the measure, and arsenals will work. Canals won't silt. The shrine won't turn into a set, and one day and night will return to its proper place. A line on a page, after which we go back to work.